Hi everyone, my name is Jen Hay from the University of Canterbury. And I want to start just by saying thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to give this talk, and also to all of you in the audience. It's a great honour to be able to present this work to you today, and I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm pleased that I get to take part, at least remotely, in the conference and tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing. So I say we there purposely because the research that I'm going to present is actually collectively produced by a large team, and in fact two large teams. So there's two parts to the work that I'm going to talk about, one that looks more at narrative structure and one that looks at phonetics. And so the group on the left is the group that's really been involved in looking at narratives, particularly led by Hayden Blaine. And the group on the right is the team of researchers, my collaborators, who look at phonetic change in New Zealand English. And the particular piece of work I'm going to talk about today is led by Gia Herring, together with Joshua Wilson-Black. Okay, so although there's kind of two different parts to the research that I'm going to tell you about, they both use the same set of recordings. And that set of recordings is known as the Quakebox recordings. And it's a set of recordings that were made after the earthquakes in Christchurch in 2010, 2011. So at that time, we suffered devastating earthquakes. One in particular in February that led to quite a substantial loss of life and loss of property. So these are some examples from the newspaper at that time. There was a lot of relocation that took place afterwards, including my own house. These are photos of my house, which was in an area that became red zoned. And so what that meant was that no one that lived in that area was allowed to stay. Most of the houses there were demolished. We actually managed to move ours to a new site. And so you can see here it is on the old site being broken into bits, so broken into 3 bits, the roof and 2 halves of the house, and then was transported overnight here on trucks to a site about 40 kilometres away. So here it has just arrived on the new site, which is the property we now live on. And in fact, where I'm now recording this talk in Dunsandel, about 40 kilometres away from the old red zone in Christchurch. Okay, so that was a very short version of a story that is actually very long and involves lots of drama, including dealing with insurance companies and so on and so forth. So we have a elaborate earthquake story that we sometimes tell about that period of our lives. And of course, we're not alone. Pretty much everyone that lived in Christchurch at that time had a unique set of experiences and had stories. And for quite a long period over those few years, whenever you saw someone that you hadn't seen for a while, there was almost a ritual exchanging of stories, where you were, where the big earthquakes hit, what's happened to your property, what's happened since, and so on and so forth. So there was a real period of storytelling in the city. And we decided to collect these stories. So we launched a mobile recording studio in a shipping container and moved it around different parts in Christchurch, and particularly to places that were particularly badly hit. So here you can see it in 2 different locations, and invited people simply to come in and tell us your earthquake story. So many of these recordings were monologues. People had the option to ask someone to sit with them as an audience if they felt weird delivering a monologue to camera. And so we recorded approximately 700 different recordings at that time. So there's a summary here of some of the main collections and the numbers of stories that were recorded in different places. We started actually at the University of Canterbury while we were setting up the mobile recording studio, and then gradually moved it around different locations. Okay, and that recording, that corpus known as Quakebox, has been valuable for all kinds of research both linguistic and non-linguistic. Obviously, a set of recordings of people's experiences at that time is valuable for all kinds of different reasons. And more recently, we decided to contact some of the people in that set of recordings and re-record them in a project known as Quakebox 2. So there's over 100 participants who were invited back, and we asked them to retell their earthquake story, and also to tell us what has happened since. And so we advertised people to come back, and also tracked people down and asked them to come back and retell their stories. So I'm going to play you just a very short snippet of one person's Quakebox 1 story and Quakebox 2 story, just so you can get a sense of the kind of thing that's happening here. So this is just less than a minute, this participant's story the first time around.
That was from outside the door, because of all the dust and everything. I knew that, you know, inhaling that wasn't going to be good. So from outside the door, I just ended up screaming and just said to him, if anyone could hear me, could you move something or move a brick or something? And the shopkeeper managed to move a brick, and so as soon as I heard some bricks, I ran in, grabbed him and just pulled him and yanked him out and got him to safety. Sort of tapped him on the back and said to him, "Oh mate, you owe me a milk for life."
Okay, and then here is the same person back 7 years later, retelling the story. This is just the very beginning of the retell.
So what I did is I stayed outside and I just screamed as loud as I could so he could hear me. I just said to him, if you can hear me, can you just move something, because we can't run in because of the dust, but if you can move something, we'll see it. And so a whole lot of bricks had fallen on him, so he was sort of covered, and then he managed to kick a brick.
Okay, so these are very short excerpts from recordings. So some of the recordings are quite long, up to an hour. Some of them are closest 10-15 minutes. But hopefully even from that short excerpt, you can see that there is, well, A, there's an interesting story being told, and B, despite the long time gap, it's very clearly the same story that is being told in both of those recordings, and the recordings contain quite a lot of similarities. So, you know, the overarching research question that we're interested here, or interested in this talk, is the degree of stability between these two sets of recordings. Okay, so I'll talk a bit more soon about what I mean by that. But first, let me tell you about the corpus itself. So all of the recordings are now time aligned to the phoneme level and stored in a database, a LabCat database here at the University of Canterbury, used by researchers in a number of different disciplines. And we're today going to be talking about the real-time aspect of the study. So we're interested in how stable the stories are, and we're going to look at this at two very different levels. One is about the stability of the narrative itself, the degree to which the story is told, the same story is told in the same way. And then, in some ways quite different, we're going to look at the pronunciation and how stable that is over time. Okay, so starting with the narrative structure. So the question here is, what happens to a story when it's told over and over and over again, and the degree to which it becomes crystallized. So certainly there's some literature that shows that retold narratives tend towards a relatively stable narrative structure, although that work doesn't tend to be quantitative or working with very large corpora. So we wanted to tackle this kind of general question of the stability of the stories in a quantitative manner. And so we, in a team led by Hayden, pictured here, worked with 107 speakers whose recordings were already tagged for broad topic type in both Quakebox 1 and Quakebox 2, and did a variety of different levels of granularity of analysis of the narrative to assess the degree to which the structure was the same across the board. Okay, so starting first with that just broad topic type. So we took the recordings and then broke the components down into general topics. There were various topics that came up across many stories. So there are a number of significant earthquakes, and so you would often get a story for each, or at least for some of these experiences. February was the big one, so that is often the bulk of the retelling. And then there are various common categories of sort of sub-stories about the way that the government responded, housing insurance sagas. Sometimes there's some preamble with personal background to the earthquakes or thoughts for the future, and discussion in general of the aftermath of the earthquakes. Okay, so here's a wee excerpt from someone's earthquake narrative, showing broadly that it can be broken up into different sub-stories. Here we have a recounting of experience from September. Then it moves on to a recounting of the February earthquake experience, and then it starts to move on to the Boxing Day earthquake. Okay, so one thing we can do is look at how much time across our two recordings is dedicated to each of these topics. And we can see, so here we've got box plots of duration, and Quake Box 1 in the red and Quake Box 2 in the blue, showing kind of the distribution across the whole set of stories of how much time is spent on each of these things. Okay, so I think there's two things that I would like you to take away from this. One is that there are some substantial differences between Quake Box 1 and Quake Box 2. Specifically around how much time is spent talking about the aftermath of the earthquakes, where that's a lot more time is spent on that in Quake Box 2, which of course is coherent because a lot more time has passed, and also we expressly ask people to tell us in that recording what has happened since your last recording. We also have a significant increase in the amount of time dedicated to talk on housing and insurance. Okay, so there's some kind of new stories in there, there's some elaborations of things clearly. We're recording at a different time. But the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is the story type that the most time is spent on, which is the February earthquake experience. That this is actually remarkably similar between Quake Box 1 and Quake Box 2. So it's not the case that in the second recording, people really shrink down their actual February earthquake experience and spend more time on the aftermath or housing and insurance, but rather the overall duration spent on the earthquake experience, at least when considered as a group, is pretty much similar actually in these two sets of recordings made 7 years apart. So we have for February, which is a story that pretty much everyone tells, and which we're going to be concentrating a lot on in this talk, quite a bit of stability in terms of how much time people spend talking about it. Okay. So then we zoom in on the February earthquake, and it's within the February earthquake that we do a bunch more annotations. Okay. So within the February earthquake, we've done a bunch of categorization according to sort of Lebovian narrative sections. I'm not going to go into the definitions of each of the different types here, because the bigger idea I think is clear as we go through, and that's about how no matter how you code things, we have some stability here, right? So for our February story, we can go through the sections and identify an abstract, a potential orientation to the story, the complicating action at the core of the story, perhaps an evaluation, a resolution, and a coda. So in this particular February story, we have some small orientation about where the person is working at this time, what the day is like, a complicating action, which is the core of the earthquake story, and then some resolution. I went home, got on Facebook, wrote a message saying that we were okay. Okay. So now if we look at the February story and look across the two Quake Box recordings of the proportion of the February story that's spent on each of these things, the abstract, the orientation, the complicating action, valuation, resolution, coda, we see that by far the most time is given to the complicating action. But we also see that within each of these categories, the distributions are very similar across the two corporate. We don't have significant differences in the allocation of any of these things between the two sets of recordings, right? So you might imagine that it could be possible that over time, the evaluation, for example, or the resolution might end up having more time, or the orientation less or something, but no, it's very, very stable. So we saw in the last box plots that the most time within these Lebovian codes is spent on the complicating action. So we've also taken the complicating action sections and tagged them further. So if we take the complicating action section, we can do an analysis of what's known as high point analysis from Peterson and McKay. And so within the complicating action, we can break things down. Here we're breaking things down into the narrative action, external evaluation, maybe there would be some external orientation. So this is a very kind of granular breakdown of what's going on within the complicating action. And if we look at how these are distributed within the complicating actions of the February stories, we also see extreme stability when considered as a group across the two corpora. Okay, and then finally, the most frequent of those codes was the narrative action. So within the narrative action, we have some further subcodes that's actually on a clause by clause basis. And so the narrative action bits get tagged as either complicating action, high point actions, or resolving. And the amount of time spent, the proportion of time spent on each of these within those is also relatively stable. And actually, we don't look at proportion of time, but go right down to clause counts, like how many clauses are spent on each of these things. We still see no significant differences between the two groups. So no matter what level of analysis you look at in terms of the structure of the story, the structures are remaining remarkably stable across these two sets of recordings. Okay, but this is when we compare QuakeBox 1 as a group to QuakeBox 2 as a group. So we can also ask whether individuals are being particularly stable with their own story. Okay, so one way of doing that is looking at a metric of similarity that takes into account word usage and also context, that kind of gets at the types of things that are being said and how they're being talked about. So this is a universal sentence encoded deep averaging network model. All we really need to know about this is it delivers a metric of similarity between pairs of QuakeBox stories. Okay, so we've done, we've calculated this for sets of randomly associated pairs. So you take a random QuakeBox 1 story, a random QuakeBox 2 story, you calculate how similar they are, and you do that a bunch of times, and then you see the distribution. So we shuffled the stories sort of about 5 times, and this gives us a baseline similarity, just in terms of how similar the stories tend to be for each other. And we also did this within QuakeBox 1 and within QuakeBox 2. The important point is that these all look similar to each other, but the distribution of similarities is much higher when we try and calculate the similarity between an individual's QuakeBox 1 story and their QuakeBox 2 story. So that's this distribution on the left. Okay. In other words, what this shows is that there is some quantifiable, statistically significant high degree of similarity between individuals' QuakeBox 1 and QuakeBox 2 stories as compared to randomly paired stories. So they're the same stories. These are the February stories. Okay. We can also look in terms of individuals, the amount of time that individuals spend on each of these things that we've looked at previously, and I won't step you through all of them, but if we ask whether durations of subparts of individual stories are consistent over time, no matter which of those levels I talked about, we look at, the answer is yes. So I'll show you just a couple of those examples, starting at kind of the highest, just like the topic-based coding. So we've got here on the x-axis the amount of time an individual spent talking about a thing in quake box 1. So we're looking in this graph at the February earthquake or the aftermath of the earthquake, and how long they spent on quake box 2. So each dot is an individual talking about the relevant topic. And the dotted black line is the X equals Y line. So that's where all the points would fall if people spent exactly the amount of time talking about each thing. Okay, so we see a couple of things. One is that the red line, the aftermath, sits significantly above the dotted line. So this is another way of showing that people in general spend longer in quake box 2 talking about that aftermath. The February earthquake sits around the dotted line. So in general, people spend about the same amount of time. The people that spent less time in quake box, a small amount of time in quake box 1, get a bit longer. People that spent longer in quake box 1 get a bit shorter. It levels out a wee bit. But importantly, there's a highly statistically significant correlation. People who talk longer about the February earthquake in quake box 1 also did it too. Okay. And then following that right down to the kind of the finest level of analysis, the distribution causes. So the proportion within the narrative action spent on complicating action, high point action, resolving action. For complicating action, we can see an almost perfect correlation. It's a bit weaker for point action and resolving action, but still highly significant correlation. So if you were someone who spent more time talking about the high point action, a higher proportion of your time talking about the high point action in quake box 1, you're also a person that spent a higher proportion of your time talking about the high point action in quake box 2. Okay, so the relative durations of various subparts of the story show remarkable individual consistency. Okay, so looking at lots of different levels of analysis, we can see a general pattern, and the pattern is that things stay impressively the same, which backs up the general kind of idea that stories that are often told can become relatively frozen in terms of their narrative structure. They have the same core structure, and that seems to stay quite stable over a long period of time. What's unusual about the analysis that we've done is that it's big and it's quantitative. It's quite unusual to combine analysis of narratives with large-scale analysis and quantification. But I think corpus shows that you can get some robust empirical evidence of stable structure by looking quantitatively at a set of retold stories. Okay. So now I want to look at a completely different level of analysis, and that's at how speakers pronounce their vowels. So is speaker pronunciation also quite stable across the two recordings? Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the vowel spaces of the monophthongs. So we've extracted all the stressed monophthongs, and we plot and normalize them, removed outliers, and so we're looking at a tidy data set with females on the left and males on the right. And the kind of center of the production, that subpart of the corpus production of stressed monophthongs. In red is the quake box 1 monophthongs, and in blue is the quake box 2 monophthongs, only shown when they are significantly different from the quake box 1 monophthongs. So that's only a few vowels. Okay, so in general, we see that from quake box 1 to quake box 2, most vowels remain stable. However, some don't. So for example, for the woman here, we see that lot has moved up. For the men, we see kit has moved up. For both of them, we have dress moving a bit more, bit backer, and there's a difference in fleece for the woman. So we do have some vowels that are different, but we also have many vowels that are the same. Okay. So the question that we wanted to pose, which fits into a much larger research program that we've been working on, is the question of whether, despite these individual vowel changes that we see, we have stability in speakers' positions with ongoing sound changes. Okay, so I think I have to set up that question a little bit for you in terms of what I mean by that. Okay, so we can look at how sounds have changed over the history of New Zealand English, which we know from the Origins of New Zealand English project. So pictured here, over the history of New Zealand English, we've seen quite a lot of change in the vowels. So starting from 1864, I'll draw your attention particularly to the trap vowel, which moves much higher, and also the dress vowel, and then the kit vowel, which really centralizes. So these three vowels together are part of New Zealand short front vowel shift, which has received quite a bit of attention in the literature. There's a variety of other changes that are happening as well. And so we've been really interested in the degree to which these vowels are changing together versus independently, and also the way in which individuals at any given time might occupy this set of changes, and whether it's possible to identify speakers that might be leaders at any particular time in some subset of these changes, or not. Okay, so just taking a slice of time there, I think this is from about the 1930s, people born about the 1930s. We can look at the distribution of the vowels. So here now each dot is an individual, and in diamond the vowels of a particular individual. So this particular individual has quite a high trap vowel here, and they've got quite a low central kit vowel compared to other vowels there. And indeed, if we gaze at all of the vowels, we see that there seems to be a bit of a pattern that this person often has very innovative vowels for their time. But I've cherry-picked this example, and the question that we wanted to ask was whether you can statistically identify kind of groups of vowels that might behave together like this. So if we know that someone is advanced in one vowel, does this predict that they might also be advanced in some other vowels? Can we identify people that are leaders in some subsets of vowels, or not? Do people tend to treat all of these vowels individually? Okay. So we've examined this using a principal components analysis, and found three subsets of vowels that seem to work together. They're shown here. And the one that we're concentrating on today is the one that's solid. So fleece, kit, nurse, lot, trap, dress. So we did find that considering this set of vowels together, they seem to work together, so that if someone is a leader in one of them, they tend to be a leader in the other, or vice versa. If they're a lagger, they seem to be a lagger in all of them. Okay, so looking at that quantitative analysis, so we can take people born over the history of New Zealand English and plot them here. They're all plotted with an M or an F. And we are able to give them a principal component score for that set of vowels, which identifies whether they're generally leading in that set of vowels or generally lagging. So people that are higher here tend to be leaders for their time, and people that are lagging tend to be laggers. Okay, so the plot is configured so kind of the baseline average for that time is in the center here following this line, the population average. Okay, so we can look at a couple of examples. So at this time, which is whatever it is, 1930s, we can see two individuals here, one that sits above the line, so is a leader in sound change, and one that sits below the line, who is a lagger. We can make this concrete by actually looking at the vowel spaces of these two individuals. So the lagger here has a somewhat low trap still, and still has kit lining up the front of the vowel space, whereas the leader, trap has moved up a little bit, and kit has centralized a little bit, and we also see some differences in the other vowels. Okay, so the lagger is producing quite conservative vowels for their time. And in fact, if we go back 20 years and find someone who was exactly average at that time and look at their vowel space, it looks pretty similar, right? And similarly for the leader, we can go forward 20 years or so and find someone who's pretty much average for their time. And we see that they have a relatively high trap, relatively central kit, and in general a vowel space that looks a bit like this leader. Okay. So you can read all about this in our Journal of Phonetics paper led by James Brand. I'm obviously brushing over a lot of methodological detail, but the point is that we can put a number on people, which indicates whether they're kind of generally advanced in this set of vowels for their time or are generally conservative. Okay, so this methodology enables us to ask whether that subset of vowels seems to be behaving the same way in the quake box. Can we find evidence that those vowels are working together in the quake box as well, both in quake box 1 and in quake box 2? And then in particular, is it stable for individual speakers across their 2 recordings? So in other words, if you were a leader in that set of sound changes in quake box 1, will you also be a leader in quake box 2, despite the fact that some of the individual vowels have actually moved around? Okay. So this is the general question that we're looking at now, whether the same subset system is observable in quake box 2. And the answer is yes. So if we repeat that analysis, we find that the same set of vowels works together in quake box 1 and quake box 2, as we found in ONSI. And so now we can position individual speakers on a scale, which indicates how advanced they are in that set of changes. And we're going to ask, is individual position on that scale stable over time? Okay, so recall we have these individual vowel changes, but we also have a lot of stability. All of the vowel changes that we see there are vowels which are in that leaders laggers subsystem that we're quantifying. So there are vowels in that subsystem changing between the 2 corpora. Despite that, individuals' relative positions within this changing subsystem stable. Or as a leader in quake box 1, still a leader in quake box 2. And the answer is yes. Okay, so here we've got on the x-axis our number that quantifies how advanced an individual is for these vowels in quake box 1, with people towards the right being leaders in quake box 1 and people towards the left being laggers. And on the y-axis is that number taken from the quake box 2 analysis. And what we see is a very robust correlation, which shows that if you're a leader, you're a leader. And similarly for laggers. So there's a high degree of stability of where people sit in these distributions of sounds. So even as the distribution itself is changing, so even if how dress is produced might change between quake box 1 and quake box 2, where an individual sits within that distribution is stable. If you're leading in quake box 1, you're also going to be. Okay. Of course, this is a pretty special set of recordings with people telling, at least in some parts of the recordings, exactly the same story, right? So that raises the question about whether the stability, this phonetic stability we see is particularly strong because we're working with retold stories. So to check that, we actually divided up our recordings into the retold sections, which tell largely the same stories between quake box 1 and quake box 2, and the distinct sections. Like, for example, maybe some of the aftermath material might be in quake box 2, but not quake box 1, and there'll be other material in quake box 1 that's not in quake box 2. So if you repeat the analysis in the retold sections and the distinct sections, you find that it's not a greater degree of phonetic stability in the retold stories. In fact, the degree of stability is even stronger, perhaps, in the non-overlapping topic material. So this particular type of stability isn't about the fact that we have stories being retold. It's about the fact that people, I think, are generally stable in terms of where they sit in these distributions over long periods of time. Okay, so I'm going to wind up. We've got this corpus of earthquake stories, and one of the things that it lets us do is examine the degree of speaker stability in 2 recordings that are made at least 7 years apart. And we've looked at this in 2 very different domains. So we've got the narrative structure domain, where we looked at the structure of retold earthquake stories. And we've got sound change, where we looked at the degree to which speakers are leading or lagging in a set of interlinked sound changes. And in many ways, these analyses are very, very different from each other. But I think they're also related in that they both reveal very high levels of stability across the different levels of representation. In the analysis of narratives, we've combined more traditional models of narrative analysis with a large-scale quantitative approach, which seems to show that frequently told stories can maintain a very clear and replicable structure over a long period of time. And the phonetic analysis looks at the production of vowels as a system rather than focusing on individual vowels, which tends to be what's done in the literature. And we do find some individual vowels shift in these speakers between the two sets of recordings, but considered more abstractly, speakers' positions within the sound changes remain stable. So leaders remain leaders, laggers remain laggers. Okay, so the Quake Box corpus opens up all kinds of possibilities for looking at long-term individual stability at other levels of analysis as well. So you can imagine asking questions about stability of syntactic choices or international contours. And I think this could in turn raise some pretty interesting questions about whether if a speaker has an unusual degree of instability in one variable, they're also more likely to show instability in another. So are there patterns that we can see across variables when we start to look at them? Okay. Finally, so when we recorded people, we asked speakers whether they wanted to make their stories publicly available. Many of them did. So there's two ways to access the public stories. One is the public archive. So you can actually go and watch videos of a large number of these recordings online at the Quake Studies website. So the specific URL is there, but Googling should also help you find it. Or if you want to do more fine-grained linguistic analysis, we've also got all of the recordings in a LabCat database with many levels of annotations. And we are happy to make that available to people if they want to work with it. So just get in touch with me. So thank you very much for listening. Here again are my wonderful collaborators, particularly Hayden Blaine, who led the narrative analysis stuff, and Gia Huring and Joshua Wilson-Black, who have led the work on the stability of the covariation of phonetics. And I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.